And at this time, it is my great honor and privilege to be able to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. He was born in New York City as the son of Jewish Holocaust surviving parents. His mother grew up in Warsaw and survived the Warsaw ghettos and the Majdanek concentration camps, and his father was a survivor of both the Warsaw ghetto and Auschwitz. He received his PhD from Princeton University as a political scientist, specializing in this Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He is a professor, an author, and an activist, and has recently become the face of leading the charge against this apartheid regime, but as all of you know, has been doing this noble work for many years now. Before I introduce this guest, I would ask that you all join me in rising from your seats as we introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. The reason I'm asking you all to rise is because he is someone who specifically exemplifies what it truly means to be a defender of the truth, a voice for the voiceless, and an inspiration for the ages through his selfless commitment to those in need. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage our keynote speaker, Dr. Norman Finkelstein.
I'm not much of a rally speaker. I tend to deal with facts, documents, and I'm most comfortable speaking to students who presumably are coming to class to learn to use their minds. And I'm going to treat everybody in the audience in the same way. So this will be a kind of classroom presentation as against a rally speaker. I was thinking on the way over what's the best approach to the situation of the moment. And what I decided to do is I'm going to divide the lecture into two parts, or the talk into two parts. The first part, I want to just go over the history and how we got to the point we are at today. And the second part, because I'm sure many of you are curious at any rate to hear my opinion of the events of the last few days and what's the likely outcome of where we're now at. Let me begin with the history. I'm not going to go through the history as a history lesson. What I want to do is look at the kinds of questions that have been asked in the past 2 years and what, at any rate, in my opinion, is the correct answer to those questions. And I will use as my foil, as they say, I will use as my foil the Pierce-Morgan program, which many of you, and maybe most of you, have tuned in the past couple of years. So as you all know, for those of you who've watched the program, the first question that was always put by Pierce-Morgan was, do you condemn what Hamas did on October 7th? And that became a kind of litmus test as to whether or not you were part of the conversation. You answered yes, you condemn. Some people condemned emphatically, wholeheartedly. And those who refused to condemn, were outside civilized conversation. I have to confess that I do not believe that was a simple question. It was a real quandary, a perplexity. It was a question you had to wrestle with. And I will tell you how I understood the question and how I understood the correct answer. The first thing, which is the most obvious, and of which all of you know, events in Gaza did not begin on October 7th. there is a long, let's call it a prehistory. The prehistory begins, you can begin wherever you like. I think a logical place to begin is 1948, when Gaza becomes a distinct entity. Now, about 300,000 Palestinians were expelled from Israel. Altogether, 750,000 Palestinians were expelled, but 300,000 of those 750,000, they ended up in Gaza. And that, I think, is the point of departure of any rational understanding of the situation there. Namely, 80% of the people in Gaza, from October 7th forward, 80% of them are refugees or descendants of refugees. It's overwhelmingly a refugee population. It's also in half, fully half, it's a child population under 18 years of age. One of the things you discover when you start reading the history of Gaza, and it was a genuine revelation for me, because I've been recently working on a new book on Gaza, and it came to my attention, I actually was not aware of it, that already in the early 1950s, when Gaza was under Egyptian administration, already in the early 1950s, when outside observers came to Gaza, some just to see the situation, others to work there, the image that constantly recurs, you'll take a figure like E.L.M. Burns, who was the senior UN official in Gaza. How does he describe Gaza? He describes Gaza as a huge concentration camp. Bear in mind, I'm talking from the very beginning, the 1950s, under Egyptian rule, Gaza is already being described as a huge concentration camp. Most of the people in this room will remember Senator Al Gore, who ran for president in the year 2000. Al Gore's father was also a senator. In July 1967, right after the June 1967 war, when Gaza comes under Israeli rule, the senator, Al Gore's father, he goes to Gaza. He then comes to speak before the Congress, our Congress, on what he saw. What did he see? He said Gaza is a huge concentration camp on the sand. That was Senator Gore. If you fast forward to 2002, a senior Israeli sociologist at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, his name was Baruch Kimmerling. He writes a little book. In passing, he discusses Gaza. How does he describe Gaza? Quote, the biggest concentration camp ever to exist. 2004, the head of Israel's National Security Council, his name was and still is, because he's still active in government or in official capacities, Giora Eiland. He's having a conversation with an American official. How does he describe Gaza? He says, Gaza, it's a huge concentration camp. That's coming from the head of Israel's National Security Council. Now bear in mind, 2004, when he makes that observation, that's before Israel imposes the brutal medieval blockade on Gaza. The blockade on Gaza begins in January 2006. What happened in January? At that point in time, the President of the United States was George Bush Jr. And he had this thing they called back then democracy promotion. And one of the undertakings was George Bush Jr. demanded that Palestinians hold elections. When the demand was made, Hamas did not want to participate because it felt that the elections were part of a fake process begun in Oslo in 1993, what came to be called the Oslo process. Most of you, or some of you, will remember it began in September 1993 when Yasser Arafat, Yitzhak Rabin, and Bill Clinton began the process that was supposed to end the conflict. It didn't, but we'll leave that aside. In any event, Hamas didn't want to participate because they felt it was part of a charade, a farce. But pressure was put on them to participate. They did. They didn't expect to win, but they did. They won on a platform not on ideology, not on trying to destroy the state of Israel. That was not their platform. They ran on a platform of reform. The Palestinian Authority, it's no secret to anybody in this room, is hopelessly corrupt and incompetent, corrupt and inefficient. So Hamas had at that point a decent record of honesty in the charitable organizations it presided over, and it also had a record of competence. So the people of Gaza voted in Hamas. The immediate reaction to this democratic election, which our president demanded, they held the election. Jimmy Carter, the former US president, he was there during the election, and he pronounced it completely fair and honest. In fact, it's said to be the first fair and honest election in the Arab world. There is some dispute about whether a prior election in Tunisia was actually the first, but leaving that aside, a completely fair and honest election, which was demanded of the people of Palestine, because it's also the West Bank, the election, and which Hamas did not want to participate in. It did participate in. It ran on a platform of reform. It won. What was the reaction? Israel immediately imposed a brutal blockade on Gaza. The blockade was then seconded by the US and then by the European Union. And then began, if we have layers, we have that concentration camp, and then a new layer, which is the blockade of Gaza, the medieval blockade. Time doesn't allow me to go through the details of the blockade, but I'll give you one example. Israel was determined to unseat Hamas from power. So it imposed this diet, D-I-E-T, on the people of Gaza. It calculated the caloric intake of every person in Gaza, and it imposed what it called a humanitarian minimum, or you can say a starvation plus diet. It wanted to keep, and it freely admitted it, at least in private, it wanted to keep the economy of Gaza on the precipice, on the edge of collapse, so that the people of Gaza would rise in revolt and overthrow the Hamas regime from within. By 2006, Gaza was, to quote The Economist magazine, which is very far from a radical magazine, it's a very conventional, conservative British publication. In general, it's reliable. It described Gaza, we're going to say just on the eve of October 7th, it described Gaza as, quote, a human rubbish heap. The International Committee of the Red Cross described Gaza as a sinking ship. The chief humanitarian official in the UN described Gaza as a toxic dump. And that was the fate and future of Gaza as of October 6th. As most of you will remember, and I suspect a lot of you have forgotten because of what happened after October 7th, Gaza had disappeared from the headlines by 2020. Nobody was any longer talking about the condition in Gaza. I have said many times, and I don't say it with pride, but it's a matter of fact, I had given up. I had written several books on the topic. I had chronicled the situation in painstaking detail. And by 2020, it was clear nobody was any longer interested in Gaza. At that point in time, say between 2020 and 2023, the only talk was about whether or not the Saudis would join the Abraham Accords, leaving the people of Gaza to just languish and die there. That was their fate on the eve of October 7th. But that's still only part of the story, because the other part is that periodically Israel launched what it called its operations in Gaza. The phrase they coined was mowing the lawn. And what did mowing the lawn mean in practice? It meant that periodically Israel launched these high-tech killing sprees in Gaza. In 2008-9, it was Operation Cast Lead. 350 children killed, 6,000 homes destroyed. In 2014, it was Operation Protective Edge. 550 children killed, 18,000 homes destroyed. And each of those operations, they did garner huge international headlines and indignation at what Israel had done. So you have the concentration camp-like conditions, you have the medieval siege, you have the periodic killing sprees in Gaza. As I said, it was described as a human rubbish heap. Most, or I should say, a significant number of the people in this room, not most, but a significant number, range between the ages, I would guess, of 18 and 25. Among that age cohort, which also made up the age cohort of the young people who burst the gates of Gaza on October 7th, they were 60% were unemployed. All they had to look forward to in each morning was to pace the perimeter of this tiny parcel of land, 26 miles long, the size of a marathon, by 5 miles wide. That was their fate and future till their last breath. So, when you fill in that background, the question of, do you condemn what Hamas did on October 7th, becomes rather more complicated. If you were to ask for an analogy, I believe the closest analogy is in our own country, but also throughout the Western Hemisphere, there were slave revolts in which were quite bloody. If you take the most famous of the slave revolts in the U.S., it was called the Nat Turner Rebellion. It occurs in 1831, 30 years before the Civil War. And Nat Turner, it's known, he gives the order to his Confederates. He gives the order. The order was, quote, kill all white people. That was his order. Kill all white people. And that's just what they did. They went around killing men, smashing the skulls of women, smashing the skulls of children. That's what the Nat Turner Rebellion looked like in practice. But there's a question. The question is, do you condemn Nat Turner? And in our own country's history, at the beginning, at the time of the Nat Turner Rebellion, the answer was almost universally yes. There was one group of Americans who refused to condemn Nat Turner. They were called the abolitionists because they wanted to abolish, to end slavery. And when they were asked the question, do you condemn Nat Turner? Their answer was, we told you so. We warned you. They're speaking to white Americans. We warned you that if you treat people this way, if you degrade them, you humiliate them, you whip them, you torture them, if you treat people this way, don't be surprised by the Nat Turner Rebellion. They acknowledged horrible things happened during Nat Turner's rebellion. They acknowledged that. But they refused to condemn Nat Turner for a simple reason. The reason was he was born into a degraded, humiliating condition. In fact, he was a very smart guy. There was an agreement among blacks and whites. Nat Turner, very smart guy. It was said of him, where did his anger come from? Why would you give an order, kill all white people? And one historian, he says, there was this huge chasm, that means like an abyss, a divide, between what Nat Turner aspired to be, and with his natural-born gifts, he had very large aspirations, between what he aspired to be and what realistically he could hope to be. That is, a slave, born into slavery, living in slavery, and dying a slave. His entire earthly existence squandered in that condition over which he had no control. And that, in my opinion, can be said exactly about the young men who burst the gates of Gaza on October 7th. And in the face of that fact, I find it very difficult, as I said when I was on the Piers Morgan program the first few months, I said I won't condemn. I am willing to acknowledge horrible things happened on October 7th. I am not going to dispute that. I have studied the record carefully, and I do think the order was not given to kill all Jews, but there was an order to target civilians. I don't believe there's any, at this point, I do not believe that's a disputable question. The issue is not what happened, but trying to make sense of what happened. And I think one can legitimately condemn what happened, but not condemn the people of Gaza who breached the gate that day any more than I believe anyone in this room would find it morally acceptable to condemn a slave who goes into revolt. Now, there's still a second question. Okay, you could say the conditions were intolerable. The international community had abandoned the people of Gaza. You can say all those things, but why target civilians? Didn't Hamas have other options? And here I believe the answer is twofold. Without going into the details, though I'm happy to if somebody wants to pose the question, the details are the following. The general picture is the following. Number one, Hamas tried diplomacy. That's a fact. Once Hamas got into power in 2006, it was sending out messages that it was prepared to compromise with Israel, either in an agreement or what you know better than myself, in a hudna, a long-term ceasefire lasting 20, 30 years. They had made those proposals. They were all rejected. It's not as if Hamas limited itself to its charter and demanded the destruction of Israel. Whether you agree with that or not, it's beside the point. Hamas made clear it was prepared to compromise on the political question. It got nowhere. Nobody would listen. Hamas then tried, I know some people will laugh, but as the British proverb says, facts are stubborn things. Hamas tried international law. whenever commissions of inquiry after each of Israel's killing sprees, there were commissions of inquiry that came to see who was responsible for what. They were going to investigate Israel. They were going to investigate Hamas. Each time, Israel refused to cooperate with the commissions of inquiry. Hamas cooperated. It tried international law. Now, some of you might think, well, Hamas cooperated because they knew the commissions of inquiry were anti-Israel, pro-Hamas, but it's not true. The commissions of inquiry, when they wrote up their reports, they were very tough on Hamas, very tough. In my opinion, undeservedly tough. That's a separate question. Hamas was willing to risk the consequences of international law. It was. Because it thought maybe they'll get some justice from these commissions of inquiry. What came of them? Each commission of inquiry assembled these huge reports. And the reports were damning of Hamas, but 10,000 times more damning of Israel because of the respective destruction on both sides. What came of these reports? Did the Hamas see justice done? The reports just collected dust. Probably 20 people read them, I being among those 20, and then they just disappeared from the political agenda. Then, let's all laugh. Let's get a hearty laugh. We all know, everybody always says, why doesn't Hamas try nonviolent civil resistance? Where is the Palestinian Gandhi? Well, actually, there were many Palestinian Gandhis. And among them, you can laugh till the cows come home. Among them was Hamas. The Great March of Return began March 30th, 2018. For those of you whose memories go back, it was a very festive occasion. They brought out circus acts, music, dancing. The people of Gaza were very hopeful that this nonviolent civil resistance would succeed. What happened? We have another commission of inquiry. It produced a 250-page single-spaced report. What did the report find? Israel, by its own admission, it lined up along the perimeter fence with Gaza its specially trained snipers. Israel, by its own admission, says every bullet hit its target. So who were these targets? According to the Commission of Inquiry, they targeted children, they targeted medics, they targeted journalists, and they targeted people with physical disabilities. They targeted double amputees. Where were these targets? According to the report, they were often 100 to 300 meters away from the perimeter fence, and they were engaged in strictly civilian activities. They were picnicking. They were observing. So, nonviolent civil resistance proved to be a dead end. So when you ask, what were the options? I honestly don't believe there were any options by October 7th. Now, it can be argued that Hamas didn't have to target civilians. It could have targeted only, quote unquote, legitimate military targets. I believe that answer is doubly, let's just call it doubly problematic, meaning it has problems. Number one, whether we like it or not, Hamas wanted to transmit the message. If our civilians aren't safe, your civilians won't be safe. You may not like that message, but one can understand that message. The other thing is, you ask yourself a simple question. Let us say on October 7th, it was, the actual numbers are approximately 400 combatants killed, 800 civilians killed. Let's, for argument's sake, imagine it was 1,200 combatants killed. No civilians. 1,200 combatants killed. Can anyone seriously believe that if 1,200 combatants were killed, Israel would have reacted with less ferocity? Is that believable? Israel is a Spartan-like society, a Sparta. And part of it being a Sparta is that it attaches more value to a military life as compared to a civilian life. Had 1,200 combatants been killed, I believe the reaction would have been not less but more ferocious than it was after October 7th. Would the international community have been less sympathetic to Israel if it was 1,200 combatants killed as against 400 combatants and 800 civilians? I find that very implausible. I think the sympathy would have been the same either way. So, if you factor in all of those considerations, I don't believe Hamas had any real options by October 7th, except to languish and die in a concentration camp. That was their only, so to speak, live option at that point. Now, the next question that Piers Morgan would ask once he tired of the question, do you condemn what Hamas did on October 7th? The next question became, but don't you believe Israel had the right to self-defense? And that, too, was not an easy question to answer. And I will just try to answer it in two ways. Number one, and I recognize there are some tiny children here, even though he is a fifth grader already, so I'll be careful in my language. Imagine a battered woman. She's married to a husband who repeatedly batters her. Let's say he batters her for 20 years. She screams, she yells, she's in torment, she's in agony, she's hoping and praying that the neighbors will hear her and do something. Well, the neighbors are aware of what's happening in that home, but they do nothing. She then, at some point, summons up the courage to call the police. The police come, they investigate, like those commissions of inquiry that went to Gaza. They investigate, they find that what she's saying is true, they write up a report, they give the report to the district attorney. The district attorney takes the report and just puts it in a drawer to collect dust, like all those UN reports. At some point, one day, she decides no more. Her husband approaches her, ready again to batter her. She takes out or reaches for the kitchen knife. She stabs him once, twice, thrice, 3 times. He then reaches for his pistol and he kills her. Now, in our current state of law, if he went to court, or if he was taken to court, prosecuted, he would be acquitted on the grounds of self-defense. But you have to ask yourself the question, did he have a moral right to kill that woman after tormenting her, torturing her for 20 years? Or was it the case that given his conduct over those previous 2 decades, he had forfeited his right to self-defense? I believe he forfeited it, and I believe Israel had forfeited its right to self-defense in light of what it had inflicted on Gaza since 1967. So, but there's a second part to that answer. The second part to that answer is, and I think it's very important to keep it in mind, bear it in mind. Israel did not exercise a right to self-defense after October 7th. That is not what they have been doing the past 2 years. It is not self-defense. Israel, on October 7th, realized there is a cliche. Every crisis is also an opportunity. Every crisis is also an opportunity. So Israel recognized, of course, October 7th was a crisis. There's no question about that. They were shattered. 1,200 corpses in one day is a large number. So we're not going to dispute that. But also, and in addition, it was an opportunity. It was the opportunity that they had been waiting for since 1967. The opportunity to once and for all solve the Gaza question. It was the opportunity for the Gaza solution, the solution to Gaza. And that was the essence of what's unfolded in the last 2 years. It is not a war of self-defense. It's a genocide. Those two things are very different. They are very different. What's the aim of a war? The aim of a war is to defeat your opponent's army. The aim of a war is to disable your enemy. Your main objective, your main target, your main goal is your enemy's army or military. In a genocide, the aim is not the army. You're not trying to defeat the army. You're trying to destroy the population, the civilian population. In the law, what's called the laws of war, under the laws of war, you're only allowed to target combatants and military sites, like tanks, armaments, but you're not allowed to target civilians. So when you talk about the laws of war, the assumption is your main aim is the military. Sure, in every war, they sometimes target civilians. It's called terror bombing, for example. You're trying to target civilians to break the enemy morale. That's correct. But you're trying to break the enemy morale in order ultimately to inflict a military defeat. That's not a genocide. You're not trying to break the enemy's morale. You're trying to destroy the civilian population. For the past 2 years, Israel has not engaged in a war of self-defense. Were that the case, I ask you a simple question. There's a large crowd here this evening. Many of you follow developments in Gaza closely. Can a single person here name me one battle in Gaza? One battle. Has there been a single battle in Gaza? No. There can't be. If you consider that Israel, as it enters Gaza, pulverizes, obliterates everything to the left of it, everything to the right of it, and everything in front of it. How can Hamas resist? Everything is obliterated. Let's take the most recent example. On March 18th, a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel ended. In the next 4 months, from March until the end of August, the estimate is 50 Israeli soldiers were killed. 50. Do you know how many Gazans were killed? The estimates are between 12 and 16,000. Now, there are a lot of people in this room who are very good in math. That comes with being from the Southwest Asia. Your son, I asked him, what's your best subject? And I knew what he was going to say before he answered, math. And that's not unusual from people from that part of the world, math. But it doesn't require a degree in math to figure out a ratio of 50 to 12,000, or 1, which comes down to 1 to 240, or 50 to 16,000, that doesn't sound like a war. That's not a war of self-defense. That's an extermination. It's a slaughter. The point being that every time you read in the paper or you hear in the media, they refer to the Hamas-Gaza war. Here's the famous note. You have 30 seconds. Every time you hear a reference to the Israel-Gaza war, you can know for certain that this is just government propaganda. Because the essence of Israel's propaganda campaign the past 2 years was to classify, to describe what's happening in Gaza as a war. Because if it's a war, the reasonable assumption is they're targeting the military. And that appears legitimate. If it's a genocide, the only possible conclusion is they're targeting not combatants, they're targeting the civilian population. And that is clearly illegitimate. So it was not Israel exercising the right to self-defense. It was Israel exercising what it took to be and what it announced from day one was a genocide. Now, when Israel made all of those statements in the first week, most of you will remember them, it was Prime Minister Netanyahu saying, remember what Amalek did to you, which was a urging to commit genocide, or it was President Herzog saying there are no civilians in Gaza, everybody is Hamas, or it was the then Defense Minister Gala saying we're not going to let any food, water, fuel, or electricity in Gaza, which is obviously a recipe for genocide if you're preventing any of that from entering Gaza. So the argument was, well, you have to understand they were traumatized, meaning the Israelis. They were shocked. They were speaking in the spur of the moment. But you know what? Do you know what's the most striking thing when you look back 2 years later? The most striking thing is everything they said in that week after October 7th, everything they said was exactly what they did. It wasn't spur of the moment. It wasn't shock. It wasn't trauma. It was the determination, we're going to solve this Gaza question once and for all. And they proceeded. They said on October 7th, we're going to reduce Gaza to rubble. They did. As the person before me pointed out, the estimate as of 2 months ago was that 92% of the homes in Gaza were destroyed. That was before Rafah and before Gaza City, so now it's probably about 95%. They said they were not going to let in food. They did. The estimate now is the entire population is facing food insecurity, and 1/4 of the population is facing a human-induced famine in Gaza. And of course, they massively targeted civilians. The current estimate coming from Israel, the current estimate is 83% of those killed were civilians. My guess, which obviously I can't prove, my guess is it's closer to 95% of those killed have been civilians. So, excuse me. So it didn't exercise the right to self-defense, and I don't believe it had a right to self-defense. And now, because of time constraints, I'm going to just fast forward to the events of the last week. And where do matters stand? The last week, Israel and the United States put forth what came to be called Trump's peace plan, 20-point peace plan. I'm not going to go into the details of that peace plan because time doesn't allow it, and most of you are vaguely familiar, at least, with the details. I'm just going to briefly address where I believe it's going to go. So, as you know, it's very hard to analyze the human mind. Human mind's a very complicated mechanism. Everybody in this room knows it. There was a famous Israeli philosopher named Yeshayahu Leibovich, and he had 4 PhDs. He was a smart guy, for sure. And one of his PhDs was in psychology. So once a journalist asked him, "Professor Leibovich, do you analyze your dreams?" And he replied, "Analyze my dreams? I have trouble enough making sense of my waking hours." And everybody in this room, at least above the age of 10, recognizes how complicated it is to make sense of your own motivations. And now we have a particularly difficult problem with the President of the United States, who poses altogether new, on a new level, the question of motivation. So at the most abstract level, I think we have to begin with the fact that the 3 primary characteristics of our president is, number 1, he's an agent of chaos. He's a human wrecking machine. He delights in it. He revels in it. The agent of chaos. Number 2, he's a stupefying narcissist. It's narcissism on a totally new level. And number 3, and this is no laughing matter, he's a sadist. He delights in bullying weak powers, not confronting those who can defend themselves, but confronting those who are not in a position to defend themselves. That you might call the psychological profile of our current president. And then that brings us to the specific case of the past week. What are his motivations? I want to stress, I do not believe there is any complexity or question mark as to Israel's motivation. They are determined to solve the Gaza question, and they won't let go. They will not let go. But obviously they can't do anything without the U.S.'s green light, which should tell you something, by the way, before I finish. You might recall during the Biden administration, they kept saying Biden is doing everything he can. He's doing everything he can. But now we come to the Trump administration. You will recall when Trump entered office, he demanded a ceasefire. Israel didn't want a ceasefire. Trump said ceasefire. There was a ceasefire. It lasted 2 months. But what the White House says goes. Now, yesterday, Trump again said to Mr. Netanyahu, they want peace, meaning Hamas, there has to be a ceasefire. Immediately, Israel agreed to it. Now, where that will go, I will get to in a moment. But we should not be fooled by this pretense that Israel controls the United States. No. When all is said and done, what the White House says goes. Now, what are Trump's concerns right now? I think it's basically three. The first concern is, I don't consider it the primary concern, but I would call it the first concern, not necessarily primary. The first concern is Trump wants the Nobel Prize by solving the Israel-Palestine conflict. By the way, just as a historical fact, so did Bill Clinton. When Bill Clinton began the Oslo process and then the Camp David talks in 2000, some of you might remember that period of Oslo and then the Camp David negotiations. There was no question what Clinton's motive was. He wanted to try to erase the memory of the Monica Lewinsky affair by winning a Nobel Prize. So we shouldn't forget that it's not just people like Trump who carry on that way trying to win a Nobel. It was Bill Clinton as well. I believe his main motivation now is not the Nobel Prize. His main motivation is very simple. Mr. Trump, I guess, is now 78 years old. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. Or a leopard doesn't change its spots. He's been a real estate developer the whole of his life, literally, because he took over his father Fred's business. And as all of you in the room know, the Saudis and other places in the Gulf, there's a real possibility of a real estate bonanza there, because the Saudis are saying they're going to carry out this huge modernization program, hundreds of billions, probably trillions of dollars. And for Mr. Trump, that's an irresistible temptation to be part of that real estate bonanza. But he knows that the Saudis and the others can't proceed on the path of normalization with the U.S. unless this Gaza genocide thing is solved. So he wants to, and that's, by the way, why he reacted so angrily when Israel targeted Qatar, because Trump feared that would sabotage the future of the relationship with the Gulf, the way Israel was carrying on. So he demanded that Netanyahu apologize to Qatar. And what did Netanyahu do? He apologized to Qatar. Whatever the White House says goes. And the third consideration, there's the Nobel Prize. I think that's overrated. There is the real estate prospects in the Gulf. I think that's underrated in public discourse. And the third is his donors. The president is a transactional sort of guy. They gave him lots of money. He owes them favors. And one of the favors is Israel. Now, I know I have to get off because I'm going to get a hook and they're going to drag me off. So I will just leave off with one last statement. The last statement is, Trump is a kind of aberration. That means deviation from the norm in politics. Because every other president operates within some institutional framework. at least broadly, you can predict where they will go, what they will decide. There's a framework. Trump, there's no framework. There is just an ego. And you cannot predict. One day he says to the head of state of Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky, he says, you don't have the cards. You don't have the cards. You have to quit. You have to give up. The next day he says to Mr. Zelensky, I think you can win. Does he base this on any intelligence reports? No, he doesn't read intelligence briefings. Does he base it on any data, information whatsoever? No. It's all just a whim. And you cannot predict the whim of this human wrecking machine, this wrecking ball. So, after having heard me out for approximately an hour, I come to the unsatisfactory conclusion. One has no idea what he's going to do tomorrow. There's no way to know. Right now, he said, Israel has to accept the ceasefire because they're releasing the hostages. But as everybody knows, part of the agreement said Hamas has to disarm. Right now, he says Hamas wants peace. We have to have a ceasefire. Tomorrow, Hamas may give up the hostages. It's already said it would. And then Netanyahu is going to say, but we're not stopping the genocide, he'll call it a war. We're not stopping it until they disarm. What will Trump say to that? I haven't a clue. Nobody knows. And you know what? He hasn't a clue. It depends on what mood he wakes up in the morning. Thank you.